Hello, good morning, everybody. We are here again with our tax talk. Today we are honored to have with us Professor Johann Hattingh of the University of Cape Town. And the Professor Hattingh is professor in tax law and is also the director of Master of Taxation of the University of Cape Town. For us, it's a good opportunity because it's important to cover all over the world what is the situation of the corona emergency. And so we would like to ask to Professor Hattingh to give us, if it's possible, a brief overview of what is happening on a under a tax perspective in the African country and South Africa.
Thank you, Luca, and thank you, Pietro, and good morning to all your viewers. So I thought I should start by saying something about the African continent as a whole. Of course, it's a huge continent. It's very diverse, both in its cultural setup and religious and political makeup. So it's hard to generalize, but what I thought I'll do is I'll start a bit about what the African Union and the African tax bodies have done about the COVID-19 pandemic. So at the African Union level, the political efforts focus mostly around the debt situation in Africa. As you can, many might know that a lot of African countries are hugely indebted to international loan funders. And of course, they will require more funding to deal with this crisis. So that is where the political discussion at the union level is focusing on. Tax-wise, there is the African Tax Administrators Forum, which is a relatively new body to which most of the African countries belong. It's headquartered here in South Africa, and a lot of the support is provided by the South African authorities. So it is referred to as ATAF, A-T-A-F. They have published a guide containing suggested tax measures for member countries in Africa. So it's quite a useful guide. Firstly, it deals with how revenue authorities should internally plan to deal with the crisis. So, as is well known, many revenue authorities in Africa are under-staffed, they are under-resourced, and one can't just assume they would know how to deal with a crisis. So the document helps revenue authorities to plan. It's quite detailed in that respect. Then secondly, the document sets out a number of administrative aspects that government should think about during the crisis. And these are mostly compliance-related issues, extending deadlines, having flexible tax payment options, suspending penalties and interest accruing on arrears tax and so on, suspending enforcement procedures, expediting tax refunds to taxpayers in order to improve liquidity in the economy. At the border, prioritizing essential goods, especially medical equipment, so that this can come into more frictionless into countries. So a lot of focus on the administrative aspects, because generally this is where tax authorities in Africa can be very poor in their performance. Then there are some substantive tax measures that this document proposes. The key one is that countries should consider temporary tax rate reductions and the introduction of special tax deductions or allowances aimed to facilitate private enterprise that supports crisis measures and relief. So that's in a nutshell what at the policy level is proposed by ATAF to its member countries. And you can see this is quite detailed. The question though is how will this be implemented?
Thank you very much. That's interesting, having also an overview of the African situation and the African position. That's I honestly I didn't know, but that's good having a document for all the countries. It would be nice to know whether South Africa or maybe other countries that you know whether they implemented or not the recommendation of the ATAF.
I've looked, of course, there's more than 50 countries in Africa, and I've tried to have an overview of what countries have done, what the actual steps they've taken, have they made announcements for the future. And unfortunately, it's a very uneven landscape. So there are some countries, and we'll talk about them just now, that seems to be very active. And there are other countries who's completely passive, who've said nothing, announced nothing. And so it's an uneven landscape in terms of countries taking up these proposals from ATAF. So maybe I'll focus on the three major economies in Africa. That is starting in the north, Egypt, moving to the center, Nigeria, and moving south, South Africa, my own country. And again, it's a three very different reactions. I'll start with the most simple one, and that's Egypt. Egypt went through a very major tax reform a couple of years ago. But for the COVID-19 crisis, they've announced only essentially one tax measure, and that is that they will implement some corporate income tax suspension or delay mechanisms. So it's a cash flow enhancement measure, and that's about it. Nothing more. It might change. Nigeria started off quite timidly, announcing only tax compliance relief measures, so extension of filing requirements, relaxing some filing requirements, the need to file financial statements, and so on. Initially, but I see Nigeria is now on the back of taking some funding from the IMF, also announced further tax measures. And this is mostly related to employment. So they've announced some tax incentive measures to that allows a reduction of employees' tax if companies don't fire their workforce, to put it bluntly. So that's also a theme. Some countries start off timidly, and then they seem to ramp up the tax measures as they get funding or resources available to fund their relief. Then South Africa, on the other hand, has been, I would say, overzealous in both addressing the crisis and introducing tax measures. Just the background, the general policy here is that the government from the start of the crisis introduced an enormously strict lockdown on the whole country. And that has been the sort of ideological position, if you will, that they're going to try and deal with the crisis head on from day one. And that you can also see that in the tax measures that's been announced here. So forgive me, I'll deal with some of the detail, but it is very comprehensive. So firstly, on employment, of course, that's the big fear here, is that there's going to be large-scale employment. The largest employment in this economy is from mining. If you shut down the mines, that is an enormous impact on labor. And then secondly, tourism, a huge source of employment. So the existing tax incentives around employment have been boosted, and thresholds have been increased, and refund periods for employment tax incentives have been reduced. So both to try and encourage employers to keep employees on board and to put more liquidity in the system via enhanced tax refunds. They've created new deduction and exemption categories that's related to employment or general COVID relief. So there's been a number of new private trusts or funds created in South Africa to provide COVID relief, funded by all the wealthy and rich families in the country. And also, if you now contribute to these funds, there's a tax benefit. And the funds are of course, they are specially tax exempt now. Then liquidity enhancement measures, there's a lot of new deferral rules of tax payment, so both for payment of employees' taxes, advanced corporate tax payments, social security contributions, all of these payment rules have been relaxed and extended to allow employers and companies essentially to retain more cash. South Africa introduced carbon tax last year. It was supposed to become effective, the first payments on the 1st of July this year. So they've extended the payment of the first carbon tax payments to October later on this year. Other liquidity enhancement measures is for individuals who rely on living annuities. They've relaxed the tax rules on that so that individuals can take out enhanced annuity payments. So these are typically people in retirement without on a tax neutral basis. What else is there? So they've, on the compliance area, they've reduced the tax penalty regime to essentially something that is now on a negotiated basis. So if large corporate taxpayers can't make tax payments, penalties and interest will be waived. And then lastly, which I guess, which are two major points, structural points for the tax system, is they've announced that the government wants to change the rules on tax losses for the corporate income tax system. And at the start of the year, they announced the measure in the budget that tax losses will be capped at 80% of taxable income. So in South Africa, you can't carry back losses, but you can carry them forward indefinitely as long as you conduct an active business, a trade. And they wanted to cap that at 80% of taxable income. So there's, well, losses are going to be a major issue in the fallout of this crisis. So they said they will delay the implementation of that cap on losses until 2022. I suspect it will be delayed even further once the magnitude of the crisis becomes apparent. The other major structural change that's been delayed is the cap on interest tax deductions. So the existing rule in South Africa is that it's essentially a formula based, like you see everywhere else in the world now, which was set at 40% of earnings, EBITDA. The government wanted to reduce that rate to 30% of earnings, effective from the 1st of January next year. Well, you know, you can imagine a lot of companies are going to take on additional debt during this crisis. So that reduction in the rate is also going to be deferred. So it will stay at 40% for the foreseeable future. And in 2022 would be the first year that they would think again of reducing the percentage. But I can also imagine that that might be delayed even further. So that is just an overview, the measures that's been announced here. As I say, it's a moving target, so there might be more measures. We haven't seen much on the front of international taxation. I haven't seen actually anything about the international tax aspects of the system that's been announced. Of course, the borders are shut here in South Africa. They've been shut now for more than a month. And so the customs rules, the only thing there that's of any relevance is that the borders are open for essential goods, and they've enhanced the customs clearance procedures. But maybe something to show you how strict the lockdown here is. We can't buy alcohol at all from day one of the crisis, and the government has also said they won't collect customs and excise on alcohol during this period. Just to give you a sense of how strict and what our living conditions are. Fortunately, I can still buy very good Italian water to drink.
Good choice. Good choice. Thanks.
We have noted, of course. No, thanks a lot, Professor, for this really, really interesting overview. It was fantastic to understand that probably you are and your government was, was predicting this crisis, because all the measures that were approved during the budget reform of last year, as you told us, are exactly in the direction to help of the crisis, because the provision of losses, then the provision of interest deduction that is in line with the other countries. For sure, I think that will be measures that will help corporation, in that moment.
Perhaps I wanted to say maybe something about another trend that might appear during this crisis. If you look at a country like Kenya, the tax reforms they've proposed under the banner of the COVID-19 crisis, it's very, very drastic reform. So it's structural reform, and it's hard to see that it's got anything to do with the crisis. So what Kenya is legislating at the moment is a reduction of the headline tax rate. So the corporate tax rate will come down from 30 to 25%. And for individual taxation, they will increase the threshold. In other words, the point where you start to pay income tax, they will increase that dramatically. So, and those are permanent changes. The way in which they're going to pay for that is essentially getting rid of most of their tax incentives. So, for example, special economic zones and that sort of thing. And they will increase their source tax rate. So dividends withholding tax will go up to 15% from 10%, for example. So those are structural reforms that probably has been discussed for a number of years. Probably has been discussed in collaboration with international funders, the IMF and so on. And you can see governments taking this as an opportunity to push through changes that they would perhaps in normal times dither, and they would consult. And overnight, now's the opportunity for them to make some changes, and they do so. Which is related to another worrying trend that you see in some African countries is the rise of authoritarian approaches to dealing with the crisis. Because they declare state of emergencies, parliaments aren't working, are not giving oversight. The same thing in South Africa, parliament is not functioning as it should. Governments are pushing through changes and rules, new procedures, which seems sometimes to be opportunistic, which is perhaps not such a positive development to witness.
No, I think also this overview of Kenya, it's very interesting, because we are discussing a lot also here in European countries how to try to help the economy, and sometimes the taxes have to be used also for this perspective. So it's an important example of what there are a lot of people, also political party, that here want to introduce free zone areas just to help the economy with taxes, or also to support with some anti-avoidance measures, the taxation, so to reduce on one side the tax burden on people and to give up the one on the corporation and the economy.
Yeah, it's a very interesting change for Kenya, because the model of using special economic zones is, of course, the Chinese model. China has been hugely successful with that. And a number of African countries have now deep economic relationships with China, including Kenya. Mm-hmm. And and deciding that you're going to get rid of those incentives completely, and rather focus on having lower rates is almost the Western model. That's what we've seen in Europe and many European countries, decreasing in rates over time in the corporate tax system, right? And that's also what the US reforms has been about, is reducing the rates dramatically and paying for it by getting rid of some other reliefs in the system.
It's true.
So quite a remarkable change in Kenya, I would say.
Also the fact that they grow up the thresholds for the no tax area for individuals, it's a very important measure to help the population. So
yes, so I should say in Africa, what you typically find is the tax base is very different from developed countries. So there would be far fewer individual taxpayers in the tax base, and overall they would depend far more on corporate income taxes as opposed to OECD countries. So yes, it is significant to up the individual tax base, but if you look at the whole tax mix, then what is done to the corporate income tax has got a far bigger impact on the tax revenue that they generate. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks. Fantastic overview. Really, really important. Really wide on the full continent. So thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks a lot.
well, it's a bit general, but
no, it's not so. It's at the same time general and in detail. So we are really glad to have this kind.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I've started to look at one or two of the other interviews. It's very interesting to watch, and I will look at them all hopefully together at some point.
Okay.
Fantastic. And we will provide you with the others we are going to shoot. Thank you. Thank you again.
Okay.
And I hope to see you in person soon in one of the international congress where we pass through.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you,
you.
Luca.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye.
Thank you, man.